That lake belongs to our community. Tear this fence down. Read the deed. I own the lake, the shoreline, and the path. The survey is valid. This is private property. Leave now.
I bought a gorgeous, abandoned lake property to live in peace. But the neighboring HOA president decided he owned my water, demanding I stay off my own land. When he called the cops to have me arrested, he had no idea my easement filing was about to trap him entirely. For years, I had been saving every spare dime I had to buy a piece of land where I could finally escape the endless noise of city life. When the old Hawthorne Mill property went on the market at a surprisingly low price during an estate sale, I jumped at the chance. It was a stunning 15-acre parcel nestled in the valley, featuring thick woods, the ruins of an old 19th-century grist mill, and the crown jewel, a pristine, 5-acre private body of water historically known as Hawthorne Mill Pond. I finalized the paperwork, got the keys, and packed up my life. The property bordered a relatively new, upscale subdivision called Whispering Pines Estates. I knew they were there, but my property was completely unzoned, unrestricted, and outside their jurisdiction. Or so I thought. My first week on the property was pure bliss. I spent my days clearing overgrown brush near the water's edge, and my evenings sitting on the crumbling stone foundation of the old mill, watching the sunset reflect off the glass-like surface of the lake. The peace shattered on my second Saturday. I was waist-deep in the water, clearing out some dead branches that had fallen near the shoreline, when I heard the distinct, whiny hum of an electric golf cart approaching. I looked up to see a pristine, lifted golf cart adorned with custom chrome rims barreling down the dirt path that connected the subdivision to the lake. Out stepped a man who looked like he had been manufactured in a factory that only produces country club villains. He wore perfectly pressed salmon-colored shorts, a white polo shirt with the collar popped, and reflective aviator sunglasses. Behind him sat a woman with a severe bob haircut and a clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. "Excuse me! Hey, you in the water!" the man yelled, waving his arms as if I were a drowning toddler instead of a grown man standing in 3 feet of water. I waded out, dripping wet, and offered a friendly wave. "Morning. I'm Arthur Pendleton, the new owner of the Hawthorne property. Nice to meet you." The man didn't smile. He didn't even extend his hand. Instead, he looked me up and down with utter disgust. "I am Richard Covington, president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, and this is Pamela Higgins, our community secretary. I don't know who told you that you could swim in our lake, but you are in direct violation of the community bylaws." I blinked, wiping water from my eyes, genuinely thinking I had misheard him. "I'm sorry. Your lake? Mr. Covington, this lake is part of the Hawthorne Mill tract. I bought it last month. The deed explicitly includes the entire body of water and the 20 feet of shoreline on the subdivision side." Pamela scoffed loudly, clicking her pen. "Mr. Pendleton, we have maintained this lake for the last 7 years. It is a Whispering Pines community amenity. Just because you bought the junk pile next door does not grant you access to our private facilities." I let out a dry laugh, realizing I was dealing with a special level of delusion. "Look, I don't want to start off on the wrong foot with my neighbors, but you need to check your plat maps. I own the water. I own the dirt under the water. I am not in your HOA." Richard's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. He stepped forward, stabbing a manicured finger at my chest. "Listen to me very carefully, you arrogant squatter. Whispering Pines has exclusive rights to this lake. We stocked it with base. We built the access dock. You will stay off the water, or I will have you cited for trespassing. Pamela, write him up for unauthorized swimming and failure to wear proper recreational attire." Pamela aggressively scribbled on her clipboard. "You're writing a fine for someone who doesn't live in your neighborhood?" I asked, utterly baffled. "The fine will be mailed to your residence," Richard snapped, turning back to his golf cart. "If you are caught in this water again, we will escalate this to the authorities. Consider yourself warned." With that, they sped off, leaving me standing on my own muddy shoreline, absolutely dumbfounded. I assumed it was a bizarre power trip and tried to brush it off, but 3 days later, I checked my mailbox out by the county road. Inside was a crisp, heavy stock envelope bearing the golden crest of the Whispering Pines HOA. Inside was a formal notice of violation. It read, Violation 1. Unauthorized use of community water features. $150. Fine. Violation 2. Operating unlicensed watercraft. My paddleboard. $200 fine. Violation 3. Accumulation of unsightly debris near community borders. The brush I had piled on my own property. $100. Fine. Total amount due. $450. There was also a completely unhinged letter attached, demanding I cease all nuisance activities immediately. They even threatened to put a lien on my property if I didn't pay within 30 days. I didn't get mad. I got curious. How could an entire neighborhood function under the assumption that they owned a 5-acre lake that clearly sat on an adjacent, privately owned parcel? I decided to do some digging. I drove down to the county records office and spent an entire afternoon pulling every deed, plat map, and subdivision filing related to Whispering Pines and the Hawthorne Mill property going back 40 years. What I found was pure gold. When the developer built Whispering Pines 7 years ago, they had marketed it as a lakefront community. They had built a beautiful paved walking path from their neighborhood center right down to the water, terminating in a massive, expensive, floating dock. But the developer never actually bought the lake. The previous owner of the Hawthorne tract, an elderly man who lived out of state, had simply ignored them. The developer had blatantly built their community dock across the property line. Furthermore, the only access path the HOA had to get from their pristine streets to the lake was a strip of dirt that cut directly across a 100-foot section of my property. They didn't own the lake. They didn't own the dock. They didn't even own the path to get there. I smiled all the way home. If Richard Covington wanted to play real estate tycoon, I was going to give him a masterclass. The next morning, I hired Gregory Fitch, the most ruthless and meticulous independent surveyor in the county. I didn't just want a standard boundary survey. I wanted every single inch of my property line staked out with neon orange flags and heavy iron pins driven deep into the earth. Gregory and his crew spent 3 days mapping the terrain. The results were even better than my amateur county records search had suggested. Not only was the HOA's entire community dock floating on my side of the property line, but the concrete anchors holding it to the shore were buried 3 feet deep onto my land. The paved walking path that the neighborhood used for their daily strolls meandered heavily onto my parcel to avoid a steep ravine. I immediately took Gregory's survey to Thomas Wright, a local real estate attorney known for destroying HOAs in court. Thomas adjusted his glasses as he looked over the documents in his oak-paneled office. "Well, Arthur," he chuckled, "they've got nothing. There's an old permissive easement filed here from 1988, granted by the previous owner to a local fishing club to walk across that strip of land. When the developer built the HOA, they just assumed that easement transferred to them. It didn't. It was an easement in gross, tied to that specific fishing club, which disbanded 15 years ago. So, what does that mean for me?" I asked. "It means," Thomas smiled sharply, "you can legally fence off your entire property line. You can cut off their path. You can dismantle that dock, and you don't owe them a single dime." Armed with the law, I decided to give Richard Covington one chance to be reasonable. I drafted a polite but firm cease and desist letter, including a copy of the official survey and a letter from Thomas Wright explaining the invalidity of their assumed easement. I simply asked that they stop trespassing, stop issuing me fraudulent fines, and stay on their side of the property line. I even offered to lease them the dock access for a nominal fee if they agreed to drop the attitude. I taped the envelope to the HOA clubhouse door on a Tuesday evening. By Thursday morning, Richard's response was clear. I woke up to the sound of loud, thumping bass. I looked out my window to see at least 40 people from the Whispering Pines subdivision swarming my shoreline. They had set up pop-up tents, massive coolers, and a giant inflatable trampoline right in the middle of my lake. Jet skis, which destroy the fragile ecosystem of a mill pond, were tearing up the water. Richard had organized an impromptu community lake day. He was standing on the dock with a megaphone, wearing a captain's hat, directing people where to park their golf carts, right on top of the newly planted grass seed I had laid down near the ruins of the mill. It was a blatant, coordinated act of intimidation. He was trying to show me that numbers made might, and that a single landowner couldn't stand up to the wealth and entitlement of Whispering Pines. I didn't yell. I didn't call the police. I simply walked over to my garage and made a phone call to a local agricultural fencing company. "How quickly can you get a crew out here to install a 6-foot, high-tensile woven wire fence along a 400-foot property line?" I asked the manager. "If you pay the emergency rush fee, I can have 5 guys and a post-hole digger out there by 6 a.m. tomorrow," he replied. Done. The next morning, before the sun even crested the trees, the heavy machinery rolled in. The crew worked with military precision. They followed the neon orange survey flags perfectly. By noon, a massive, impenetrable wall of steel wire and thick wooden posts sliced directly through the HOA's paved walking path. Because the path curved onto my property, the fence essentially created a dead end. Worse for them, the property line cut straight across the shoreline, right before the dock. The dock was now completely trapped on my side of the fence. There was no way to reach it without scaling the 6-foot wire or swimming around it. I was sitting on my porch, drinking an iced tea, when Richard Covington discovered my handiwork. He had driven down in his golf cart, likely to admire the damage his lake day had done to my shoreline. When he hit the fence, he slammed on the brakes so hard the cart fishtailed into the mud. "Pendleton!" His voice echoed off the water, shrill and panicked. I strolled down the hill, taking my time. "Afternoon, Richard. Having a good day?" He gripped the woven wire, shaking it violently. His face was a terrifying shade of purple. "What the hell is this? You have blocked community access. You are violating an established easement. I am going to sue you for everything you own." "There is no easement, Richard," I said calmly. "I sent you the legal documents. You chose to throw a frat party on my property instead. So, I built a fence. Good fences make good neighbors, right?" "This is vandalism. You destroyed our path," he shrieked, pointing to where the fence posts had been drilled straight through the asphalt of the walkway. "It's my dirt under that asphalt," I replied. Pamela Higgins suddenly arrived, jogging down the path, completely out of breath. "Richard, the residents are complaining. They can't get to the dock." "Call the police," Richard barked at her. "Call 911 right now. Tell them we have a hostile squatter maliciously destroying community property and barricading a public right-of-way." Pamela whipped out her phone and frantically dialed. 20 minutes later, a county sheriff's cruiser rolled down the dirt road. Sergeant Reynolds, a man who looked like he was about 3 days away from a well-deserved retirement, stepped out. He took off his mirrored sunglasses and let out a long, exhausted sigh as he surveyed the scene. A screaming HOA president in a captain's hat, a terrified secretary, a massive new fence, and me, calmly holding a thick manila folder of property deeds. "All right," Sergeant Reynolds said, resting his hand on his duty belt. "Who called it in? And who is going to explain why I'm dealing with a fence dispute on a Saturday afternoon?" Richard immediately launched into a frantic, spittle-flying tirade about how I was holding their community hostage. He demanded my immediate arrest. He demanded the police tear the fence down. Sergeant Reynolds listened patiently, then turned his gaze to me. "Well, son, your neighbor here says you've illegally blocked a right-of-way." I handed the manila folder over the fence to the officer. "Sergeant, I am the sole owner of the Hawthorne Mill tract. Inside is a certified survey, my deed, and a letter from my attorney. There is no easement. They are trespassing." Sergeant Reynolds opened the folder. He read the surveyor's seal. He read the lawyer's letter. He looked at the orange flags that perfectly aligned with the newly driven fence posts. Then, he closed the folder, handed it back to me, and turned to Richard Covington. Sergeant Reynolds closed the manila folder, handed it back to me over the top of the woven wire, and turned his exhausted gaze toward Richard Covington. "Mr. Covington," Sergeant Reynolds said, his voice flat and authoritative. "This is a certified survey from a licensed county professional, backed up by the deed to the Hawthorne property. As far as the law is concerned, this fence is entirely on Mr. Pendleton's private property. You do not have an easement." Richard's mouth opened and closed, like a fish suffocating on a boat deck. But the community. We have walked that path for 7 years. It is an established public right-of-way through continuous use. That sounds like a real compelling argument for a civil judge, Reynolds replied, tipping his hat back. But out here, today, it's private property. If you or any of your residents attempt to scale, cut, or otherwise damage this fence, I will arrest you for trespassing and destruction of private property. Do I make myself absolutely clear? Pamela Higgins gasped, clutching her clipboard so hard her knuckles turned white. You're just going to let him steal our lake? He can't steal what you never owned, ma'am, Reynolds said. He turned back to me, giving a curt nod. Have a good weekend, Mr. Pendleton. Call us if they cause any more trouble. As the cruiser kicked up dust down the dirt road, Richard shot me a look of pure, unadulterated venom. He didn't say a word. He just spun on his heel, marched back to his golf cart, and drove away, leaving Pamela to awkwardly jog after him. I thought the police intervention would be the end of it. I was incredibly naive. When you strip a man like Richard Covington of his perceived power, he doesn't reflect and apologize. He retaliates. The following Monday marked the beginning of a coordinated neighborhood-wide harassment campaign designed to break my spirit and force me to sell. It started with the noise. At exactly 10 p.m. every night, residents whose properties backed up to my wooded acreage would wheel massive Bluetooth speakers onto their patios and blast heavy metal or screeching static. It was just loud enough to be a nuisance, but just quiet enough to dodge a noise ordinance violation by the time the county dispatch could get a deputy out there. Then came the lights. 3 homeowners, clearly acting under Richard's directives, installed high-intensity, stadium-grade LED floodlights on their rooflines, pointing directly through the trees and illuminating my bedroom like a prison yard during a jailbreak. Finally, the drones arrived. They would hover 30 feet above my property line, buzzing like angry hornets, recording my every move while I tried to enjoy my morning coffee on the porch. I documented everything. Every light, every noise, every drone flight. I kept a meticulous logbook, but I refused to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. I just kept working on restoring the old mill. 2 weeks into the siege, I was in my garage late at night, repairing a chainsaw, when I heard a soft knock at my side door. I grabbed a heavy wrench, cautiously opening the door to find a woman in her late 30s looking nervously over her shoulder into the darkness. "Mr. Pendleton?" she whispered. "I'm Sarah Jenkins. I live at 414 Oakwood Drive, over in Whispering Pines. Please, I don't have much time, and if Richard finds out I'm here, he'll make my life a living hell." I lowered the wrench and stepped back, gesturing for her to come inside. "Come in, Sarah. What's going on?" She stepped into the garage, shivering slightly despite the warm summer air. "You need to know what they're planning," she said, pulling a crumpled stack of papers from her jacket pocket. "Richard held an emergency, closed-door HOA board meeting last night. He is out of his mind, Arthur. The neighborhood property values have already taken a hit because we can no longer advertise as a lake access community. 2 pending home sales fell through this week when the buyers saw your fence. That's unfortunate for the sellers, but it's not my problem," I replied, crossing my arms. "It is your problem now," Sarah warned, handing me the papers. Richard convinced the board to levy a special assessment of $1,000 on all 200 homes in the subdivision. They are raising a $200,000 legal war chest to destroy you. He hired Clayton Hughes. I recognized the name. Clayton Hughes was a sleazy, high-priced litigator from the city who specialized in dragging out civil suits until the opposition simply ran out of money and surrendered. I looked down at the documents. They were minutes from the HOA meeting and a draft of the lawsuit. "They're suing me for adverse possession?" I asked, genuinely shocked. "Yes," Sarah nodded. "Richard is claiming that because the neighborhood openly and notoriously used the lake and the path for 7 years, the HOA has legally assumed ownership of that portion of your property. He's demanding a judge order you to tear down the fence and sign over the deed to the water. Adverse possession in this state requires 20 years of continuous, uninterrupted use," I said, reciting what my lawyer had already taught me. "They've only been here for 7. The developer built the subdivision 7 years ago. Clayton Hughes told Richard that doesn't matter," Sarah explained, her voice tinged with disgust. "Hughes said the goal isn't to win the case on its legal merits. The goal is to bury you in so many injunctions, discovery requests, and legal fees that you go bankrupt and have to sell the property to the HOA for pennies on the dollar just to pay your debts. It's a war of attrition, Arthur. She looked at me with genuine sympathy. A lot of us in the neighborhood hate Richard. We didn't want this assessment, but the board voted it through, and if we don't pay, they'll put liens on our houses. I just wanted you to have a heads up. Brace yourself. Sarah slipped out the side door, disappearing back into the trees. The very next afternoon, a process server showed up at my gate and handed me a thick stack of legal bindings. The HOA had officially filed the lawsuit. I didn't panic. I just smiled, tossed the documents onto my passenger seat, and drove straight to Thomas Wright's law office. Richard Covington wanted a war of attrition. He was about to find out that when you dig up the past, you sometimes unearth your own grave. Thomas Wright flipped through the massive stack of legal filings, his reading glasses perched precariously on the bridge of his nose. For 10 minutes, the only sound in his oak-paneled office was the ticking of a grandfather clock and the rustle of thick legal paper. Finally, Thomas tossed the binder onto his desk and let out a booming laugh. This is Clayton Hughes' standard playbook. He throws everything at the wall: adverse possession, prescriptive easements, nuisance claims, hoping the sheer volume of paperwork will terrify you into a settlement. Can they bleed me dry like Sarah warned? I asked, leaning forward in my leather chair. Thomas's eyes gleamed with a predatory excitement. Arthur, when someone files a frivolous lawsuit, it opens the door to discovery. That means we get to subpoena every single document, permit, and email the HOA and their original developer ever filed. If Richard wants to examine the legality of how this neighborhood interacts with your property, we are going to look under every single rock. And so, the legal battle began. Over the next 3 months, I spent thousands of dollars fighting off ridiculous injunctions. Richard would stand at the property line on weekends, smirking at me through the wire fence, convinced he was draining my bank account to zero. He didn't know that Thomas and I were digging into the very foundation of Whispering Pines. The breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday morning. Thomas called me, his voice practically shaking with excitement. "Arthur, get down to my office right now. We didn't just find a smoking gun. We found the whole artillery cannon." When I arrived, Thomas had a massive topographic map spread across his conference table, alongside a stack of environmental permits. "Look at this," Thomas said, pointing a gold pen at the map. When the developer built Whispering Pines 7 years ago, they had a major problem. The land was naturally a marshy basin. To build houses, they had to drain the swamp. They installed a massive subsurface drainage system. "Okay," I said slowly. "Where does the water go?" "It has to go somewhere," Thomas grinned. He traced his pen from the subdivision, straight across the property line, terminating right into the Hawthorne Mill Pond. They secretly piped the neighborhood's entire stormwater runoff system directly into your lake. I stared at the map, the realization hitting me like a freight train. Wait. My lake is a privately owned, closed-loop ecosystem. They are dumping untreated street runoff oil, fertilizer, trash into my water? Exactly, Thomas said, and it gets better. Remember that massive 50-foot floating dock they built on your side of the property line? I pulled the original invoices from the contractor. To save money, the developer used heavily toxic, chemically treated lumber that is strictly banned by the state for use in stagnant, historic waterways. They never pulled a Department of Natural Resources permit for that dock. Richard Covington hadn't just trespassed. Under his watch, the HOA was actively committing severe environmental violations on a historically protected waterway. "What's our next move?" I asked, my heart pounding. "We don't just countersue," Thomas said softly. "We go nuclear. We call the State Department of Environmental Quality." 2 weeks later, Thomas and I sat at a long mahogany table in a neutral mediation room at the county courthouse. Across from us sat Richard Covington, looking incredibly smug in a tailored suit, alongside his lawyer, Clayton Hughes. Pamela Higgins was there too, frantically organizing her beloved clipboards. "Gentlemen," Clayton Hughes began, his voice dripping with condescension, "my clients are willing to offer a generous settlement. You sign over the deed to the 5-acre lake and the access path, and we will drop the lawsuit and pay you $5,000 for your trouble. Otherwise, we continue to litigate until you lose your entire property to legal fees." Richard leaned back, lacing his fingers together. "Take the deal, Arthur. You're out of your depth." Thomas Wright didn't look at Clayton. He didn't look at Richard. He simply reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick, bright red folder bearing the official seal of the State Department of Environmental Quality, DEQ. "Mr. Covington," Thomas said calmly, sliding the folder across the table, "before my client considers your offer, I suggest you review the findings of Inspector Bradley Whitman from the DEQ, who visited the Hawthorne property last week." Richard scoffed, but opened the folder. As his eyes scanned the first page, his smug expression vanished. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. "What is this?" Clayton Hughes demanded, snatching the folder from his client. "That," Thomas said, leaning forward, "is a notice of severe environmental violation. Your developer illegally routed a municipal drainage system into a private, historic waterway. Furthermore, the toxic dock your HOA claims ownership of is leaching illegal chemicals into the soil. Because your HOA has aggressively claimed ownership and maintenance of that dock and drainage system in court, the state is holding the HOA fully liable." Pamela gasped. "Liable? For what?" "For the fines," I spoke up, staring directly into Richard's terrified eyes. "The state is fining the Whispering Pines HOA $10,000 a day until the drainage system is rerouted and the dock is removed." "That's impossible," Richard shouted, slamming his fist on the table. "We can't reroute an entire neighborhood's drainage. It would cost millions. And we can't remove the dock? Your fence is in the way." "I know," I smiled, feeling a profound sense of satisfaction. "And the state mandates that you cannot use heavy machinery in the lake to remove it. You have to dismantle that 50-foot toxic dock by hand from the water. I suggest you buy some waders, Richard." Clayton Hughes looked at the documents, then at his client. "Richard," the lawyer whispered, his voice trembling, "they have us dead to rights. If the state enforces this, the HOA goes bankrupt within a month." The war of attrition was over, and Richard Covington had just nuked his own kingdom. The silence in the mediation room was so absolute you could have heard a pin drop on the thick carpet. Clayton Hughes, the high-priced, arrogant litigator who had promised to ruin me, was frantically reading through the Department of Environmental Quality documents. You could practically see the dollar signs evaporating from his eyes. When a state environmental agency drops a hammer like this, there is no smooth talking your way out of it. The fines were absolute, and the liability was entirely on the HOA. "Mr. Covington," Clayton said, aggressively shoving the documents back across the table, "you told me this was a simple adverse possession case over an old walking path and a recreational dock. You did not tell me your subdivision was actively piping municipal runoff into a protected watershed. My firm does not handle federal or state environmental defense." "You're my lawyer," Richard stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. "You have to fix this. I am withdrawing as your counsel, effective immediately," Clayton stated coldly, snapping his briefcase shut. He stood up, adjusted his expensive tie, and looked over at Thomas Wright. "Well played, Thomas." Truly. Without another word to his shell-shocked client, Clayton Hughes walked out of the room. Pamela Higgins looked like she was about to faint. She was clutching her clipboard to her chest, hyperventilating. "Richard," she squeaked, $10,000 a day. We only have $60,000 in the reserve fund. The neighborhood will go bankrupt in a week." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the mahogany table. "You know, Richard, if you had just stayed off my property, if you had just ignored me and let me rebuild my mill in peace, I never would have hired a surveyor. I never would have found the dock encroachment. I never would have investigated the drainage pipes. You did this to yourself." Richard didn't have a smug remark this time. He just buried his face in his hands. The fallout over the next week was nothing short of spectacular. Word travels fast in a subdivision, and thanks to Sarah Jenkins, my informant, the truth spread like wildfire. The residents of Whispering Pines realized that the special assessment they had been forced to pay wasn't going toward a legal victory. It was going toward a massive environmental fine brought on purely by their president's fragile ego. On Thursday night, the HOA held another emergency meeting. I wasn't there, but Sarah later described it to me as an absolute bloodbath. Faced with the reality of liens being placed on every single house by the state, the neighborhood revolted. They unanimously voted to recall Richard Covington and the entire existing board. To my pleasant surprise, they elected Sarah Jenkins as the new interim president, tasking her with one singular goal: clean up Richard's mess. The following Monday, Sarah and Thomas Wright drafted a comprehensive, ironclad settlement agreement. I held all the leverage, and I didn't hold back. Here were the terms of my surrender. Term 1. The HOA would immediately dismiss their frivolous lawsuit with prejudice, meaning they could never file it again. Term 2. The HOA would reimburse me for every single penny of my legal fees, totaling just over $28,000. Term 3. A permanent, legally binding no-contact order was established. No resident of Whispering Pines was allowed within 50 feet of my property line. Term 4. The HOA was required to fund the rerouting of their stormwater drainage system. This meant ripping up their pristine, manicured cul-de-sac to install a massive underground retention basin on their own property. Term 5. The toxic floating dock had to be removed within 14 days, entirely by hand, with zero heavy machinery touching my shoreline. Sarah signed the agreement on behalf of the HOA with a relieved smile, but I had one final, petty stipulation. I required the previous board members, specifically Richard and Pamela, to be the ones to physically execute the dock removal. If they refused, I would not grant them access to the water, and the state's daily fines would resume. Which leads me to the most glorious Saturday morning of my entire life. I sat on the front porch of my newly restored mill, a steaming mug of black coffee in my hand. Down at the water's edge, Inspector Bradley Whitman from the DEQ stood with his arms crossed, watching like a hawk. Wading waist-deep in the cold, muddy water were Richard Covington and his former board members. Gone were the salmon-colored shorts and the popped collars. Richard was wearing oversized rubber chest waders that made him look like a deflated balloon. For 8 grueling hours, under the hot afternoon sun, they had to use crowbars and handsaws to meticulously dismantle the massive 50-foot dock. Every time they dropped a piece of the toxic lumber into the water, Inspector Whitman would bark at them, threatening to add another fine for careless contamination. They had to haul heavy, waterlogged planks through the thick mud, sweating profusely, covered in algae and duckweed. Pamela stood on their side of the fence, no longer holding a clipboard, but holding a trash bag for the debris, looking utterly miserable. Every now and then, Richard would pause, wiping mud off his forehead, and glare up at my porch. I would just raise my coffee mug in a silent, cheerful toast. By sunset, the dock was completely gone. The HOA had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars fixing their drainage pipes, completely draining their community funds. Whispering Pines lost its status as a premium lakefront community, and Richard Covington quietly put his house on the market 3 months later and moved away in disgrace. As for me, I finally got the peace and quiet I paid for. The fence stayed up, the trees grew in thick, and the old Hawthorne Mill Pond returned to its natural, pristine state. Sometimes, the best way to deal with a bully isn't to fight them, it's to let them dig their own grave, and then hand them the shovel. And that is how an entitled HOA president's power trip ended up costing his neighborhood everything. If you loved hearing Richard get exactly what he deserved in the mud, hit that like button and subscribe for more unbelievable real-life drama stories. What would you have done if you found out your neighbors were pumping dirty water onto your land? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to share this video with anyone who loves a good dose of HOA karma.